So, you may have heard that there was an announcement last week in worship, or received an email, or heard it through word of mouth. But there was an announcement that I'm going to be leaving my position as pastor of youth ministries at the end of the summer. Now, these are not easy decisions. I've been here for almost 10 years, and change is scary for everybody. Change is hard. There are risks in these types of changes, and I am just as nervous about what is next as anybody. But as I think about what we are called to be and how our faith drives our steps into the unknown, it's a good place to lean into. I was inspired by the message that Ariel provided us last week in talking about Esther and Vashti and how their actions in the world were very brave and very dangerous. Making very brave and very dangerous decisions, not just on behalf of ourselves, but on behalf of others. It's a big deal. And yet that tends to be where God shows up. Coming from lower status and using power to bring about change and justice for all, as Ariel shared, was a model by which we should follow. So today we talk about Elijah. The text from 1 Kings is a story actually that it kind of comes back around on me every several years, and I get to look at it through a different lens. And I, this week, spent some time on the little bit of scripture before it, and it came with a whole new perspective for me. So we have Elijah in the cave, and he is talking to God, and he's talking about how he's persecuted, and people are after him, and he's going to get killed, and how awful things are, and he's here hiding out. And I had forgotten why he was hiding out. So what happens right before this is Elijah is the prophet of Yahweh, or the God as we understand out of the Jewish tradition and into the Christian tradition, Yahweh. And he is kind of put in this position of, against the prophets, of another understanding of God, as they looked at it as a different God named Baal. And it's this weird, competition to see whose God is more powerful. So, my God's more powerful than yours. No, my God's more powerful than yours. Okay, let's settle this. So they go through a practiced ritual to see which one in their prayers would show up to build a fire on the altar at their sacrifice. And the Baal worshipers are praying and nothing happens, and then Elijah goes up and sets this whole sacrifice ritual together, and fire shows up, and everybody says, "Oh, your God is the real God. Okay, your God is more powerful." And then the response is that Elijah says, "Okay, now go kill all those prophets of Baal," which seemed a little dramatic, maybe a little excessive or extreme. So this was the expression of how powerful Elijah was and how powerful Elijah's God was in the midst of things. And then the leadership, the Jezebel, gets this message. She was in a high role of authority and gets this message. She is a Baal worshiper and hears about this whole thing and then says, "Everyone, Elijah is now public enemy number one." And people are seeking him out to end him based on what he's done. So, that leads us into the cave. And that leads us into Elijah's plea and hiding out. What I find interesting in this is Elijah was feeling pretty good about himself, feeling pretty powerful, feeling pretty emboldened, feeling like I'm on the right side of history. I'm in the position of authority. What we can control this. We're going to end the lives of people on the other side. But when there was some pushback, he runs and goes and hides in a cave. And I love that actually at the beginning of this, the first thing that when he gets to the cave and God goes to him and says, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And so there's this whole experience of these big expressions of might and power and earthquakes and flames and wind and hurricanes that God is not present in. These big, powerful, strong, very visible, visceral things that we could say, yeah, there's God. God's not in those. But this gentle whisper, and depending on the translation you hear, you've heard it's the sound of silence, actually. The like crushing sound of silence. Gentle whisper, gentle breeze. And in this moment, Elijah covers his face and exits the cave because he experiences the presence of God there. It was in the moment of silence, in the least notable moment, in the least perceived as physical, powerful moment, that God shows up. And then he asks Elijah again, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It's easy to see God in those moments where we feel most powerful, where we think we are in the right. The easy moments when we are surrounded by a bunch of like-minded, powerful people. We have the numbers, we have the strength, we have the voice. It's easy to see God in that. And yet, Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, where the text from Matthew came from, says, when you do acts of charity, or service, or care, or loving, if we want to fill in, charity has a real weird connotation in our language, but it would be understanding. When you are giving of yourself for others, don't have it trumpeted before you. That is what the hypocrites do in the synagogues and the streets, that they may be praised by others. The truth is, they've already received their reward. When you do acts of charity, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Your good deeds must be done in secret. It's hard to be quiet when we do acts for the sake of others. It feels good when we can draw as much attention to how great we are and how much we serve, or especially in different moments, how can we be glorified? How can we ourselves be the focal point of even things like our advocacy? Now, we draw attention to ourselves in appropriate and helpful ways at many moments. I have many friends who are marching in the Pride Parade, people who are straight, people who are of the LGBTQ plus community, people of all different walks and gender expressions. And they are standing in solidarity with people around them, some people who have experienced persecution, etc. And that's important for us to do, but it's also important to understand why we're doing it. Sometimes the idea of being woke, the idea or concept of being enlightened or being an advocate or an ally is great when you are in a community of like-minded people, when you are immersed in a setting that celebrates that and advocates for that. And yet it becomes a very different thing when we encounter adversity, when we encounter challenge, when it doesn't just become about being a loud voice, when that loud voice may draw negative attention. Now, it does matter how we represent ourselves to the world. We had a group of youth who were staying overnight here at the church and left this morning before everybody started coming in, and I had a chance to pray with them, and I talked with their adults, and one of the interesting things, they actually left us a very nice little thank you note, as you can see. But one of the things that they said was, and they're from somewhere in between Wichita and Lawrence, Kansas, a smaller community, said, wow, I think it's really cool how inclusive you are. You got the big flag out front, so on and so forth. Goes, yeah, we're trying, but it's a little harder where we come from. Yeah, and I said, thank you. You know, it's something that we own. It's something that we identify as a reconciling community. And for us to be able to express that to the broader communities is important. For those who have experienced persecution, being devalued based on who they love or who they are, to see those symbols matters. I had talked with a pastor who was unsure about whether they were talking about whether we become reconciling, how do we express that? And well, you know, we are who we are and we can be that. I said, yeah, but you're not necessarily doing it for you all. The message you are communicating is the one you are communicating to the person who won't walk through your doors because you have a cross on the front of your building, or because you have the word Christian church on the front, because that in and of itself has communicated a narrative and a message that people hear and receive and understand in a particular way that sometimes we have to counteract because of how the Christian church has approached the LGBTQ plus community. What does it mean to be an ally? An ally, terminology-wise, refers to those who stand in solidarity, maybe those who are of what's called cisgender, right, and how they identify or are in a hetero relationship or alternate gendered relationship. Refers to those who are standing in solidarity with those who have been oppressed and harmed. Question is, for us, how far does that allyship go? How far do we branch out? Where does it push into in the expression of our own identities as a community, but also as individuals? And when we encounter challenge to it, when we are taking risks in how we express it, do we run to the cave of safety or convenience? Does it extend past resharing a post on social media with a rainbow graphic? Does it extend past having a rainbow flag on the front of the building? Now, this is Pride Month. This is also today, Juneteenth. The Juneteenth as being that expression of the day and the celebration of the day that the message of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation and the freeing of all of the slaves reached Galveston, Texas, which is kind of understood as the farthest point from where it was communicated. A communication to all that the slaves were no longer slaves, but they were an identity in themselves as free humans. This is a celebration of liberation, of freedom. How are we celebrating today? Because the reality is this is something, it is a day that we should, and we understand, is a momentous point in the history of this country. If we identify outside of the African American community, if we identify as both the person who is celebrating with, but the recognition of that the enslavement of our brothers and sisters was being done by our brothers and sisters in history. That is our reality. And so how do we, in our own identity, celebrate that liberation? The moment that I remember from some time ago was shortly after the murder of George Floyd. Those of you who know that I work in downtown Minneapolis in the security industry and was kind of there indefinitely based on a lot of the unrest that followed, that I do not correlate to the demonstrations that followed. But I did have a chance, and again, not anybody else's business, but I use it as an illustration. I did have the opportunity to walk over toward North Central University on the day of George Floyd's memorial. And with many others who were standing in the adjacent park, got a chance to listen to the people speaking, and in particular the Reverend Al Sharpton as he was eulogizing. And one thing that drew my attention and focus was how Reverend Sharpton says, you know, we have never seen the number of white people marching with us as we have today. We affirm that that solidarity is happening. We've never had the experience of so many non-African American people joining us in standing up for justice. That's great. But I wonder, how has that movement endured? Sometimes I think that it is easy to only react when we think we are supposed to, when the lights are shining bright. And then when we move into our everyday life, it is easy to run back into the cave, to hide out when those tough conversations of our everyday experience become challenging. Recently in Minnesota here, we had the charter amendment that was considering in response whether or not what structure that public safety would take. And this is not a statement on the voting necessarily one way or the other. People came across with a wide variety of different experiences and perspectives. But I give this one piece as an example that it was voted down in the dissolution of Minneapolis Police Department, was voted as a no within that charter, so the charter amendment did not move through. One of the interesting things I looked at statistically in the following days was to see where did the voting percentages end up. What I found interesting was in North Minneapolis, which is in the areas where the most racially diverse, the areas are high concentrations of the BIPOC community, Black, Indigenous, persons of color, there wasn't one voting precinct that voted yes. Now, there were plenty of other precincts around the city of all different ways and shapes and sizes and demographics that did vote yes. But as that information was shared, I heard somebody respond to it, a white person who said, well, I don't know what they want anymore. I'm out of this. And I said, really? I don't know what they want? It was easy to be in solidarity when they thought they knew, but as soon as that narrative changed for them, they had the privilege of being able to step away. Racial justice, if we claim it as part of our identity, if we claim allyship as part of our identity, is not something we can step away from. If we are allies, and our allyship is in alignment with our faith, then Jesus is telling us this isn't just about the places that we can be noisy. This isn't just about those moments when people have megaphones. It is an everyday life experience. If we are in alignment with our faith and our allyship, then we must demand change and justice. In the names of Ania Allen and Trinity Smith, 2 young children killed by gun violence last summer, with the same fervor and emotion as we do for the children in Newtown, Connecticut, and Uvalde, Texas. Both accountability for the taking of lives and systemic change that prevents such violence from happening in the neighborhoods of North Minneapolis as much as Sandy Hook. If we believe in socioeconomic justice, then we must be intentional about how we spend our money every day. Make choices toward BIPOC-owned and operated businesses, even if it means driving a little farther, taking a risk to go outside of our comfort zone in our geography for the sake of another. If we are in alignment, then we are making investments in Minneapolis public schools in constructive and purposeful ways. Certainly there's financial options, but what does it mean for us to invest as a volunteer? Reading books to kindergartners, tutoring at middle school and high school age students, and maybe doing so in a neighborhood or a demographic context that is different than the one that we experience regularly. If we are celebrating Pride today, then being fervent in our own demands for denominational change. Here in the United Methodist Church, there is a big shift in change and separation that we are in the midst of. So what does it mean for us to stand for the ordination and equal celebration of marriage for the LGBTQ plus community in the United Methodist Church? What does it mean to educate ourselves theologically so we can communicate how biblically there does not need to be an understood position from Christianity that is condemning of the LGBTQ plus community, that is affirming and lifting up of all expressions of God's creation. Not just about walking in the door of a church on Sunday mornings with a rainbow flag on the front, but wearing that flag on our hearts every day. The hard work comes when the news cameras turn off, when the media cycle changes, when the hashtags of Juneteenth and hashtag Pride stop trending. The hard work comes when there are no likes or shares or retweets to affirm our voice of advocacy. When the only people who know about your investment, your allyship, is you and the person that you ask not to use that particular word because it hurts you, even if it's not directed toward or applied to you, that is God showing up in the gentle whisper. When you actively choose to invest emotionally and spiritually in the lives of young people, in particular students of color, you are a messenger reaching Galveston, Texas, communicating the equal value of all people within the racial mosaic of our country. And doing that in the left hand without the need for affirmation or acclaim by the right hand of the world. That is God showing up. The risk in allyship, it is great. The humble work of aligning our faith and our everyday life takes work. It's hard. And it's not about self-glorifying, and sometimes is messy. It means we have to give things up, like time, like fear, at times even money. But that enduring work, it is bigger than June 19th. It is bigger than a month called Pride, bigger than a season of COVID. It is the everyday existence of our createdness that brings about the change we seek in the world. That, when we are aligned with that, when our allyship is represented in that, that is the silent but transformative loving presence of God in the world. May it be so. Amen.